Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Well, Michael, here we are. It is April 8th. This is not a Friday. It's a Tuesday.
It's a big change.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit change this week. And I thought what we would do, given the tariff issues that are going on, I thought it would be worthwhile for us to talk a little bit about the history of China and its government and the way it is governed, and then kind of compare that to the way that our country is governed, and then try to have a discussion about what we think that means in the context of the ongoing issues over tariffs, specifically with China. And just to set the table, as of right now, what has happened, and I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right, but directionally, it is correct.
So let me ask a question with a story. You know, I'm trained as an engineer.
Yep.
And I heard once that if you ask an engineer about a problem, they will try to assess what the problem is, what the solution is, and how do you get from the problem to the solution. A businessman pretty much operates that way too. But if you ask a politician that question, he will say, why are you asking me that question today?
Right.
And so my question for you is, let's talk a little bit about why we want to talk about China and the United States in relation to what's going on in the U.S. right now. It's one of many countries we're putting tariffs on. Why the focus on China today?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Here's the answer for me for this, is that there are two major political issues that are economic in nature. I'm not talking about border issues per se. I'm not talking about crime. I'm talking about two economic issues in the country. One is that we're running huge federal deficits every year. We've reached a point now where we're approaching—
This is budget deficits. You're not talking about trade deficits yet.
Yes,
budget
exactly. Thank you. Budget deficits. We're approaching total debt of $37 trillion. We're still running at a rate of $2 trillion a year, and that level is unsustainable.
We're borrowing money hands over fist, and it can't go on forever.
That is unsustainable. For that issue, which is related but not directly, for that issue, what the goal of what I believe to be the Trump administration is to get that deficit down to around 2% of GDP by the time he leaves office, which would mean somewhere in the $600 to $800 billion range, down from over $2 trillion.
So cut it by 2/3.
Yes, that's that deficit. But the other deficit that we have that also is unsustainable is our trade deficit. And our trade deficit started to grow in a meaningful way around 1995. And now it's reached a point, and in fact, it has more or less reached this point for about, I'm going to say, 10 years. But it's now to the point where if we continue down this same path, what the Chinese are doing with the money, and it's hundreds of billions of dollars a year in trade deficit, and that includes goods as well as services. So our trade deficit in total with the rest of the world is about twice as much as our trade deficit is with China alone.
So it's half of our total trade deficit. It's the major source of the problem, is what I hear you saying.
Right, and that runs anywhere. It might be 40% one year, it might be 50%, but that's where the major problem is. But our trade deficit with almost all countries exists because the trade barriers for other countries to sell their goods into the U.S. market are much lower than, and this is as a general rule, are much lower than the reciprocal, either tariffs or restrictions. In Europe, for example, what Trump talks about in Europe is that while their tariffs may not be exorbitant, they put rules on the products that make our products not meeting their regulations. And Trump says that's intentional. because some of the things that they require make no sense except unless you're trying to keep U.S. goods from being able to be sold in Europe. And
so, for example, maybe the French don't really want California wine challenging their great wine industry, so they pass rules that make it hard to import California wine.
Correct.
Something
Correct.
like that. I don't know that for a fact, but I suspect it's true.
Right. Or they may put restrictions on cars. That where the U.S. it would be very expensive for the U.S. to meet a requirement, and then they might not even apply that same requirement to their own cars. And then, for example, another one is the VAT tax. Value-added tax is a tax in Europe where they tax every element of production. They add a sales tax, as it were, to that.
So every stage of production is taxed, and it ends up being in the price level at the end.
Yes. Of their domestically sold, manufactured and sold cars, but if that car's exported, they take away the VAT tax.
They refund it,
and they refund. Yeah, thank you. They refund the tax. So all of a sudden now, the cost of making a car sold in Europe is higher than the cost of exporting that same car.
So two quick observations before we pitch into it. One of the themes here is that China is by far our biggest economic rival.
Yes.
Russia doesn't come close. No other country, any country in Europe, doesn't come close to China. So as we talked in recent decade or two about the pivot to Asia with our foreign policy, this is all about the rise and size of China. So we're going to talk about the difference between China and U.S. today. The other thing I want to point out is I saw an article by, I think, Victor Davis Hanson, said that this started at World War II. If you think about what was happening just after World War II, Germany, England were destroyed. Their industrial bases were wiped out. A lot of people had been killed in the productive ages of their lives. And so this policy was a way of getting them back on their feet. At the time, we didn't care so much about trade deficits. But as times have changed, now they're our rivals, and the rules that applied made sense after World War II now have created this enormous imbalance in who's selling what to whom. Right?
Yes.
And there's all these arguments about whether it's good to have a trade deficit because they've got to use the money to invest in us, and that stuff can be a little bit confusing. But what's very convincing to me is that this has resulted in a hollowing out of our industrial base and the social problems that come from that in terms of despair, drug dependency, the problems that we've seen in some parts of the old Rust Belt have to be addressed.
Yeah, and when manufacturing moves abroad, there's a whole bunch of jobs, as you point out. There are a bunch of jobs that go away, right. and so then other people might make that money. But what's happened over the years is there've been about 5 million manufacturing jobs, and that's a very, very large number of jobs in a particular segment that have gone away. Now there are a number of reasons that has happened. But some of it is certainly public policy, where we kept our barriers for trade coming in low, and other countries raised theirs. And so where we are today, and I would add that China is not only an economic rival, you can also argue that it is a geopolitical rival.
Yes, becoming a military rival.
Yes.
It's a major military threat to us, the cyber attacks and all of that.
Right. So you have allies, you have neutral parties, you have adversaries, and if you're at war, you have enemies. China would be somewhere in the category right now of an adversary.
Yes.
And
well said. I like that.
Yeah. And so at any rate, so what I wanted to do here is kind of talk a little bit about the history of China, so that when we think about how China might react to the policies of the Trump administration, which his policies are very different than any president in my lifetime. So just to go back, Nixon went to China in the 70s, and that was a big deal.
A huge deal because he ran on anti-communism.
Yes.
And the Alger Hiss spy cases, and he was a known vigorous anti-communist.
Yes.
So for him to go to China and open up relationships with a communist country was inconceivable until he did it.
Right. Now, then Deng Xiaoping took over China after Mao's death. And Nixon met Mao, but Nixon's meeting Mao didn't really change anything, because Mao stayed a hardcore communist, and China didn't open at all because of that visit. But it was the first meeting
Around 1970?
in the 70s. It would have been, Nixon was president from 68 to 74, so it would have been the early 70s.
He was in the middle of his second term when he resigned.
When he resigned.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And that was in around 74.
Okay.
Somewhere right around there. And then Deng Xiaoping, Mao dies.
In the 70s around?
In the late 70s.
Maybe 80.
Yeah.
Like that.
And Deng Xiaoping takes over. Now, Deng Xiaoping is the one who then decided that we need to keep an authoritarian state, but we don't need to keep a communist state. And even though they continued to call it the Chinese Communist Party, they allowed for private ownership.
Okay.
And so under strict Leninism, the central government owns the means of production, owns and controls the means of production.
And this was about the time you went to China, if I recall, around 1980?
I went in 1989.
Okay.
Yeah. So many years later, I go to China, and just to kind of set the stage here, when Kathy and I went to China, any city that we went into, that we visited, we had a government employee as our guide. And they were there to make sure that we weren't doing anything that we shouldn't do from a spy standpoint or something like that.
Right.
And they were all very nice, but they were employees of the government. And we had a car, and we had a driver, and we had a guide, and then we had a car. And when we would go down the road, we were the only car on the road. And there were thousands and thousands of bicycles, and think of a marathon at the beginning of the Boston Marathon when you have thousands of people running. Think of it if you were a car in the middle of those thousands of runners, and you were going a little faster than the runners. How they'd have to separate to let your car pass, and they'd come right back together behind you. That's what these bicycles were like.
And the driver, a swarm of some animals.
Yes, yeah, and the driver would beep the horn like a heartbeat, and so it'd just be beep, 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 and the bicycles would separate, and then they'd come right back together, and so that was
the buildings were one story, maybe
old, very old and
wooden,
dilapidated. Pollution. The air was there weren't any cars, but the air was still terrible because there was coal. What energy they had was coal.
And this is in the cities, and it was probably worse in the countryside.
Poverty was worse in the countryside. We did go to some smaller towns, but even then, a smaller town in China was still a very large town.
Yes.
And so we went around China, and in 1989 it was very poor. And we were in a restaurant. We saw another American in the restaurant, and we chatted with him for a bit. And it turned out he was with Caterpillar Tractor. And I said, "Good gosh!" I said, "You ought to be able to do great over here as China's opening up." And he said, "Well, because when we'd see people doing road work, and it was all done by hand, and so there was no machinery, and so you'd have thousands of Chinese with picks.
A way to keep them employed.
Yes, and they would pick at the road and break up the asphalt.
Yes.
And then they would be moving down in groups of thousands or hundreds, and then right behind them would be hundreds with these little brooms and these almost like somebody cleaning up the floor of a room, and they'd sweep the broken up asphalt and then dump it into a barrel, and then they'd roll the barrel away someplace, and then somebody would come along behind them and they would hand pour the new asphalt, and somebody would come in behind them and stand
all manually done.
All manually
I've heard
done.
that if you want to get rid of unemployment, just get rid of trucks and carry boxes on your back from Nashville to Chicago or to Los Angeles. There's a lot of labor that could be absorbed that way, and our standard of living would go in a tenth.
It'd be like that. Probably worse.
Yeah.
Worse than a tenth. And so at any rate, so he said they haven't figured out, because I said one of your big machines can do the work of every one of hundreds of Chinese. He said that's true, but they haven't figured out what to do with the other 99% of those workers. And you have a centrally controlled economy, And so there's no entrepreneurship. Literally, you were not allowed to open a business. And so anybody who had a little business, and when we were in Shanghai was very different than Beijing in that Shanghai was kind of the merchant area.
Right, it's a port.
And there would be little stores, and you would go in, and everything was negotiated. So there, Americans are used to going into a store and seeing the price and saying, okay, that makes sense, and going and buying it, checking out and buying it. In China, if you pay the retail price, they think you're a fool, and you probably are, because they've got it marked up probably 500% more than they're willing to take.
So I went to China 8 or 10 years ago, and Shanghai is like Manhattan. Parts of it are like Times Square, just incredible. And where they have come in that period of time, from 1980 or 89, whichever we picked, to now, less than half a century, and it's just incredible the change that has happened there.
Yes. Well, I went about every 4 or 5 years, starting in the late 90s through 2000 and probably 10. And every time I went, there was something major that had changed, like the train system or the interstate system or the airports or certainly the skyscrapers. When I went in 89, the tallest building in Shanghai was the Sheraton Hotel. It was 40 stories high, and it stuck out like a sore thumb. In other words, it wasn't one of many buildings over 30 stories. It was one of very few over 30.
And now there's dozens in a row.
Oh, yes. Yeah, all over. And so
today we're going to be talking about the difference between the Chinese system and our system and what that means in terms of fruitful trade, geopolitical conflict, and the future of America's place in the international economy.
Yes, and also systems of government and what it means. And so in China, when Deng Xiaoping took over, he decided to open up China and make it and allow people to build companies. And but the political system was still called the Communist Chinese Party. And by the way, the Communist Chinese Party, China's population is about 1.4 billion. The Communist Chinese Party has always been under 100 million. And you don't just decide, I think I'll join the Communist Chinese Party. You have to apply. You have to be vetted. So you can't even be a member of the party without going through a process. And a lot of people are rejected, obviously, because less than 10% of the population are actually members of the party. And the party governs, but it rules the country. So Deng Xiaoping comes along, and he is the head of China from 1978 to 1989. But what I want to do, Mike, before I get to that, I want to actually go back a bit in Chinese history, because I went back and I looked and I said, how did China become the way that it is? And I want to say that because we built a company together, and we market under the giantsofpoliticalthought.com. It's called giantsofpoliticalthought.com. And it is a series of audio programs on history's most influential thinkers. And we're talking about Western thought, which includes Karl Marx, for example. Right. We include him, even though we don't agree with him. But we include him because we cover about 400 to 500 years, going back. I think our earliest one is Machiavelli.
Right, 1500s in Italy.
And so we cover and these are the people whose ideas changed the way that Western society was governed. Because back before, just 300 years ago, all societies were ruled by kings or monarchs or dictators. But there was no such thing as elections the way the way we think of them here in the United States, anything like that. So let's look at China. And this is fascinating. I went back and I've been reading some books on China, and one that I will highly recommend is The Red Emperor by Michael Sheridan. And a lot of what I say is I got from that book. The other book that I would recommend is Kevin Rudd, who is the former Prime Minister of Australia. It's more of an academic book, but still quite good, and it's on Xi Jinping and his China. And so these come from that. But the first emperor, and this is fascinating, the first emperor of China, and I am going to mess up these names. I will say that to begin with.
Let me just get my head straight, because these Chinese names kind of run together for me. Xi Jinping is the current
Xi
leader of China.
Jinping is the current leader.
There was Mao Zedong and then Deng
Xiaoping,
that liberalized. But now when you say this book talks about Xi Jinping, this is the current guy who's kind of going back toward the Mao model, I think.
Yes. No, well, what I'm talking about right now, I'm going back to the first emperor
Yes.
of China,
Yes.
which is back to 221 BC.
Right.
So because it's important, once again, the giants of political thought.com is a place where people can go to hear the ideas that moved Western society into believing that in individual rights, and that it was the role of government was to serve the people, not rule the people.
Yes.
But China has never experienced that, never. And so the first emperor of China, and it's Qin Shi Huang.
Yeah.
And he consolidated China. China was a bunch of warlords prior to 221 BC. So over 2,000 years ago was the first emperor, and he began a dynasty. And Chinese history is one dynasty would succeed another dynasty, and dynasties were hereditary in nature.
Yeah.
So
and I think they call that one the Qin dynasty, I believe is the way you say it in Chinese, and it's where the word China comes from, because it's such a long-standing, powerful dynasty. So
yes.
Qin, but you spell it Q-U-I-N.
Q-I-N. Q-I-N.
Yeah, it's a big problem to translate those hieroglyphs that they use into American names.
So I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm pronouncing the names accurately.
Yeah, both of us are pretty ignorant about this, and we're guessing.
Right. But he ruled by brute force because he had just defeated the warlord, so he really had no choice but to rule by brute force. And he did that, and every dynasty, and there were a series of dynasties over the more than 2,000 years, so 2,200 years of dynasties and emperors,
right.
And they might last. A dynasty was hereditary in nature, and the longest running dynasty lasted 790 years.
That's 3 times the age of the United States now.
Yeah, and think about it, because you might serve as the emperor for 30 years, and then it would go to your son. It always went to your son. But then dynasties would be overthrown, and then another dynasty would come, and it would be another family line. But every single dynasty, the most important thing for every single dynasty was to keep China unified. That was the one thing. So no matter who the dynasty was, and they all ruled by force.
Because the alternative, I guess, was war. If they weren't going to be unified, they were going to be fighting.
Yes.
I mean, this is the same objective that Lincoln had.
Yes. Well,
save the Union.
Yes. And you could
actually,
Mike, you could even go back to our Articles of Confederation were written to govern the United States after govern America, I guess, after the Revolutionary War. And it didn't work because the 13 colonies were at each other's throats within 5 years of the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. So here you have these Chinese emperors who have and the population of China is not homogeneous. There are all kinds of different. I don't think
ethnicities. There's Mongolian. There's Sichuan. There's different regions.
And there's dozens and dozens of languages where if you live in China, you don't know the formal Chinese language. The official language for the government is Mandarin.
Yes.
But there are dozens and dozens of languages that are as different as French and English.
And so knowing that brings into new meaning what unity is and can be.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a great big themes here of centralization versus decentralization, of unity versus diversity. And, political thought is ultimately about that and some other central things, but that's a key one.
Yes. And for the history of China, they never argued over what is the proper relationship between the individual and the state. They've never had that argument. So they have no concept as a people of democracy in anything like the way we think of it.
We later did audio tapes on the political hotspots of the world. We did a history of China in 3 hours. of one program, and it was a marvel of compression to take these thousands of years. I mean, speaking of getting away from the trees and the forest, we were so far above the forest, but it's fantastic because of the breadth of perspective you got. But what I remember the author saying is that the Chinese have no concept of individual freedom. To them, freedom is to be not ruled by a foreign force, a foreign power.
Right.
So it's a collective freedom from oppression by another power. There's no concept, according to him, and there's no historical concept of individual freedom.
Mm-hmm. And so China then so we have a succession of emperors that all ruled essentially dynasties that all ruled essentially the same way until the last emperor, which was in 1912.
Great movie about that.
Yeah, it was really a wonderful movie.
Yeah. What is
and the last emperor happened because there was some disturbance in the country,
right.
and so they kind of created what was called the Boxer Rebellion, and they did that. It was kind of an intentional thing, and then it got out of hand, and it resulted in the abdication of the last emperor.
When you say it was an intentional thing, it was an intention by whom to do what?
By the government, by the emperor, so they could then put it down, and assert their dominance, and it got out of hand, and so the last emperor was overthrown, and then China at that point it reverted for a number of years, and we're talking about only decades now as opposed to centuries. For a number of decades, there was no central power. There was an attempt at it, but there were all these factions, and that continued until the Second World War, which in China they call it the Japanese War, because Japan invaded China in 1931 into Mongolia,
right.
And then in 1935 they invaded the mainland, and the nationalist government at that time, which was still pretty darn weak by historical standards, it fought the Japanese. Until the war ended in 1945. And in doing that, it itself, the nationalist army and the nationalist government, the Chinese economy collapsed. It was already weak, but Mao Zedong did not participate in the Second World War. He took his people and they kind of moved over to the West and waited for the war to end. And then when the war ended, Mao came and with the Chinese Liberation Army.
Right.
Took over China and chased the nationalists to the island of Taiwan.
Yeah, they were led by Chiang Kai-shek. I think I remember his name.
Yes.
And so this more westernized kind of way of governing was minimized and sent to a little island. And so we're still working on with China's ambition to absorb that back into the greater communist whole.
Yeah. Now, and when you said Western, it's interesting because when Chiang Kai-shek and his maybe million followers, I don't know, 2 million, it wasn't a large number. When they fled from the mainland to Taiwan, Taiwan was an island with nothing. Mm. So you can't run a society with nothing without giving people the right to some level of property so that they'll do something. So Taiwan became one of the 4 Asian tigers, which each one of them started being ruled by a dictator who allowed for private property. One of them was South Korea. Mm-hmm. One of them was Taiwan. One of them was Singapore. And I think the other would have been Hong Kong.
Okay.
Before those were and they all their economies grew dramatically. And
2 parallels I'd like to draw. There also comes a time when there's an opening to Japan. I think it was in the 1800s when an admiral or a commodore or somebody sailed into there, and that was the opening of feudal Japan. Great movies about those periods as well. But think about Russia after the World War II, or up in the 80s actually, when it fell. They attempted glasnost. Their control was collapsing, and Gorbachev decided they had to allow some opening to allow people to build an economy to stay alive, and it got out of hand.
Right. Exactly.
And overthrew the Soviet Union. Very similar.
It was not intended to. You're exactly right. It was not intended to. Now, Japan was ruled by an emperor up until the Second World War. And when the United States defeated Japan in the Second World War, one of the things that we required was that the emperor would lose his power. I think there was still an emperor, but it would be like the king or the queen of Great Britain, in that you had a government that was elected.
They allowed them to keep it afterwards, but it was more of a ceremonial position rather than this godlike figure.
Right, exactly. And but anyway, so going back to China, so now you have now Deng Xiaoping takes over, and China is absolutely broke. They've just experienced the Cultural Revolution, which lasted for 10 years, from 1966 to 1976. They experienced what is called the Great Famine. And, the experts, it varies whether or not 30 million people died of starvation, up to 60 million. But it was a massive number of people who died of starvation. And this was all because of Mao Zedong's policies of just absolutely brutal dictatorship. And Mao also wrote a lot. And so there's the Little Red Book, which is kind of his thoughts.
Yes.
And that's important in the context of what we're about to talk about. So Deng Xiaoping then becomes the. So I'm going to just look here. Deng Xiaoping is the head of China from 1978 to 1989, and then he was succeeded by Jiang Zemin, and that was from 1989 to 2002, and he continued to keep Deng Xiaoping's policies of opening private ownership of certain things. They privatized a lot of industries. There was certainly private property in terms of developers could build housing units, and that a lot of that was used to fund the local governments, because at that time China literally owned 100% of all the land. The government owned 100% of all the land. And so what China did as it was developing was it would allow the local provinces to sell the land on 99-year leases to a developer who would then build a high-rise apartment building or condominium. And then the government would take the money from the 99-year lease, which was like buying the property. It would use that to fund about 50% of the operations of the local government. And then people would buy the apartment units or the condominiums, and so building office buildings, the things that you've seen, the office buildings, commercial building cities, was a huge part of the Chinese economy for a period of about 35 years.
The two things going on there. One is that there was a great migration from the countryside into the cities,
yes,
where people could get jobs and live above a poverty level. Also, there was such huge unmet demand in almost every sector. I work with an eye surgeon here in Nashville, and he's Chinese, came here and went to MIT and then Harvard and has a PhD in laser physics, and then he is a fantastic doctor. He's one of the best in the world, lives here in Nashville. But he has helped start an eye clinic chain in China, and they open a clinic on Tuesday, and they are full up on Friday and forevermore. There is so much unmet demand for eye surgeries and treatments. It grows like topsy. In the United States, the same guy produces about 3 times the level of other doctors, but it's a struggle to get people in because so many people have already been treated.
Right.
So you have this unmet demand when China starts this opening. So there's an endless demand for any supply that you start. So they just grow like weeds.
And the other part, Michael, that China had at the time of Mao Zedong was farming was done by hand. And it was also communal in nature. In other words, the government owned whatever you produced. And that's why they had massive famine. And so you had people who were dispersed in the countryside because it took a very, very large percentage of the population to grow the food to feed the population. And so when things started to open and they started building factories and they started to export, and when they built the factories, it was for the purpose of exporting. It wasn't to build factories to supply goods to the Chinese people because the Chinese people were so poor. They couldn't afford to buy anything at the beginning.
Right.
And so then the farmers would then flock to the cities because the jobs in the factories were better jobs than farming by hand.
Right.
But when Kathy and I went there in 1989, China had just opened up what they called farmers markets or open markets. And before then, all of the their version of a grocery store were owned by and stocked by the government, and they were generally just cardboard boxes full of rice, just your very basic stuff. And in 1989,
not much innovation is what I hear you saying.
Not much and the variety of food was almost nothing. Right. Noodles, only the wealthy.
Starch, and more starch.
Yeah. And so at any rate, but then the open markets. Kathy and I we'd go into these open markets just to observe how they operated. And there would be chicken farmers, and they would literally have live chickens. And people would go over and they'd say, "I want to buy that one." And they would say that in Chinese. But I could tell it there because they were pointing. And the guy would reach down, pick it up by the neck, and wring its neck, cut off its head, and bag it. And then they would be selling eels, and the eels were literally in a barrel. And somebody would say, "I want that eel," and they would go up there and pinch the eel, cut off its head, and then slice it and bag it. So, I mean, you were getting fresh eel. Chicken was about as fresh as you could get it. And so these open markets, the people in there, it was an enormous number. Right next door would be the government supermarket, grocery store. Nobody in there.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
It was fascinating to watch. Yeah. So at any rate, so then.
Let me just say, we were talking about starch. That's really a reflection of poverty, because when we went there more recently, when I went there 8 or 10 years ago, their markets were fantastic.
Oh, of course.
The vegetables, and just beautiful food there.
Yeah. And we're talking back when it was where the average income might be, by our standards, $100 a year, might be.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, but it was just abject widespread poverty. And in 1989, it was abject widespread poverty. But you could tell that things were beginning to happen in 1989. Well, then Hu Jintao then succeeds Jiang Zemin.
I'm glad you're saying this.
Yeah, I'm doing the best I can, and that was from 2002 to 2012, and that was those two. They oversaw China during their greatest growth period, but the Communist Chinese Party was still the dominant political force in China, but each of these dictators, they call them general secretaries. China there are 3 parts of the government where if you're the head of any of those parts, you are very, very important. And one is the general secretary, which is the government. One is another area that's the civil side, the legislative side, which if you're head of it, you're in charge of the laws. And then the other was the military.
So when you say the government, is that like the executive part of the government?
Yes.
Then you have a legislative part of the government?
Well, legislative meaning it was the lawmaking. The lawmaking,
yeah.
And it's still communist in nature, but there are people who make the laws, and so you have the general secretary, who's the most powerful person in China. Then you have another person who's head of the, for lack of a better term, the executive branch, but not at the same level as the general secretary. And then the third one is head of the military.
Okay.
And the person who's head of the military is a very, very powerful person, and somebody that the general secretary is always concerned that the head of the military is going to overthrow them.
Right.
Okay. So because there's still tremendous intrigue, even during these periods. But once again, stability was the most important thing. Unification was the most important thing.
And correct me if I'm wrong, they don't have an independent judiciary. I think they do have some courts, but the government wins about 99% of the time, if I remember.
They have a judiciary, and it was more rule of law during the 30 years prior to Xi Jinping. Okay? So in other words, when Deng Xiaoping I'm not saying
After
they were
Mao and
fair.
before,
After Mao
before
and
the current guy, Xi Jinping, there
Yes.
was about 30 years of liberalization. There were courts.
general liberalization would be a good term. Now, nothing like what we would think of, but for them it was liberalized in a great deal in terms of property, in terms of law, in terms of the relationship between the individual and the government,
Contracts, things like that.
things like that. Yes, and so then so now Xi Jinping takes over in 2012, and then he consolidates power. And he is now head of all three. When I mentioned earlier all those very important positions, he now is head of all three. So he has consolidated power. He is now head of all three.
So he's been there well over a decade, and my understanding is that he has abolished any limits on his time to stay in office.
That's
he's
correct.
there for life.
That's correct.
Kind of like Putin has done in Russia.
Yeah, correct. Exactly. And he also has written a number of books or statements. He's a lot like Mao in that you have Xi Jinping's thoughts.
Oh, he's a spiritual leader.
Yes. So he has written a lot.
Like 70 books, right? I think it's
150.
Like 150.
150 and wait, hold it. 140.
I wonder if he actually wrote them all, you think?
Well, they're not really long books. They're speeches.
Yeah.
They're speeches or by subjects. But they're put. Each one is put in its own book form, and many people in the government are required to buy the books and to read them.
It's a good way to get your sales up.
Well, according to Michael Sheridan, his royalties have been $150 million from his books. Mm. So it's a good way to enrich yourself.
Nice gig if you can get it.
And spread your thoughts. But according to Michael Sheridan and according to Kevin Rudd, Xi Jinping is now ruling China in more like Mao. And that gets us to this question about the tariff issue, the issues between the United States and China today. But I wanted to give that history of how China has developed for 2,000 years under the rule of emperors and dynasties for 2,000 years. And then you had Mao, who ruled as head of the Communist Chinese Party, but ruled like a brutal emperor. And then you had a period of 30 years where you had some liberalization. And now you have a leader who says, we can't continue on that if we're going to maintain the power of the central government.
Let me ask you about public opinion, because some people observe that public opinion really, in the end, is what rules in the West, that the politicians can't get too far ahead of it. They have to respond to it. But it's very important in terms of controlling what happens. In China, does public opinion have any kind of meaning?
The general public opinion does not. Public opinion within the party does matter. Now, but also, if you are a brutal ruler and somebody has an opinion that is contrary to what you want and you're the ruler, what Xi Jinping does is he investigates them, he indicts them, and he convicts them. Yeah. According to Michael Sheridan, over 2 million people have been investigated, indicted, and jailed, or worse, under Xi Jinping.
They've disappeared in some way.
That
is an astounding number.
Yeah.
2 million people. And you said there's how many in the Communist Party?
85 million. So Xi Jinping deals very, very brutally with any political rival. So now let's take that mindset. And by the way, Xi Jinping's upbringing, he came up, he was very young during the Cultural Revolution and during the end of Mao.
So Cultural Revolution was what Mao did in the 60s.
Yes.
Okay.
And his father, Xi Jinping's father, was one of Mao's lieutenants, who was put in prison by Mao because during the Cultural Revolution, Mao put Deng Xiaoping, who was his right-hand man, put him in prison for a number of years. Anybody who he saw as a threat, Mao put in prison. And Xi Jinping's father was one of those people.
Okay.
And so then after Mao, Xi Jinping's father was rehabilitated. And Xi Jinping himself has now served in various positions within the Communist Party in governance of this province or this city or that city, and he worked his way up. But once he was selected as the general secretary, unlike his two predecessors, he moved to consolidate his power, to eliminate any viewpoints that were adversarial to his or contrary to his. And so he now rules China more or less with an iron fist. But that doesn't mean that the economy of China is doing well. And therein lies the rub. Because I saw a Wall Street Journal article, we talked about this before. Wall Street Journal article says there are 90 million housing units, residential units in China that are either empty or partially built. I can't get my mind around the amount of waste. And then there's these ghost cities that have office buildings
that are vacant,
beautiful roads, shopping centers, condominiums, and the whole place is just empty. The whole cities are empty.
And so back to a comment you said earlier, this is the way the governments financed themselves, was to rent the land on 99-year leases. And
fully paid up front.
Fully paid up front. And so they've gotten their money. There's no more money coming from these empty buildings.
Right. And so now the local governments are running up huge debts. The gross debt in China is actually greater than the gross debt in the United States. And so China's economy is not nearly as robust as it was 10 years ago. And the pressure that Trump is putting on the Chinese economy, because now we're circling back to the beginning of our podcast here. We have two deficits here in the U.S. that are not sustainable. One is our trade deficit is not sustainable, and one is our federal deficit is not sustainable.
Budgetary deficit.
And Trump is trying to address both of those. Now, in the case of the trade deficit, he is imposing enormous tariffs on China unless China will change its ways so that we can ship more goods and services into China. That'll be a real problem. Agreeing to that, Xi Jinping's mentality is not his mentality is to take his political opponents and put them in jail.
Right.
So how this is going to be resolved with China is going to be very interesting. Now, one of the things that China started doing a few years ago was they would export product that was made in China. They would export it to a neighboring country like Vietnam. They would then have a label made in Vietnam slapped on that product, and it would be shipped to the United States. The United States is now wise to that practice and is eliminating it. And probably the way they're going to eliminate it is to make the importer warrant that anything coming out of Vietnam was actually made in Vietnam and not just transported to Vietnam. And so that'll put enormous pressure on importers to know the source of the product that they're importing.
So this is sort of like laundering. You hear about money laundering where people have made illicit profits through arms trade or whatever, something that was prohibited, and they send it somewhere so that it appears to be legitimate. And when it comes out of there, it looks good.
Yeah.
Right. So they're laundering Chinese product to make it look like it's conforming to the trade rules.
And they've been doing that for about 10 years, and it's got ramped up to where our trade deficit with Vietnam is $100 billion. It's huge. And so at any rate, Trump has essentially imposed these tariffs all over the world. The purpose of the tariffs is to bring you to the table so that we can conduct fair trade. Reciprocal tariffs is the word that Trump uses. Well, reciprocity is in dealing with China. This is going to be interesting to watch because the Chinese history, the idea of negotiating and reciprocity and respecting mutual rights is not part of their culture. And so it is, Trump is determined to rebalance that trade, and I don't know exactly how it's going to turn out for the U.S. I'm generally optimistic about the overall change in. I think that the trade deficit will shrink over the next few years, and I think Trump is very serious about having fair trade. And we still may lose out on certain products that are cheaper, more cheaply made, and that it doesn't make sense for us to make them here. But you're going to see, I think you're already seeing announcement after announcement of reshoring into the United States manufacturing. And the manufacturing in the United States
means to take a plant that has been built overseas to get economic advantage, lower labor costs and low tariffs and all of that. Now it's with these new rules, it will be more advantageous to build it in the United States and then put the jobs where
put the jobs here, or the manufacturing here. And I parsed that just a little bit because part of it was contract manufacturing from China, where the Chinese owned the factory, but contracted to make the goods, which then were shipped to the United States, and frankly were shipped to the United States.
Like iPhones.
iPhones, clothing, shoes.
It's really an American product, but it was being built there by a contract manufacturer and then exported to the United States.
And there were some U.S. manufacturers who did build factories. But now what Trump's policies are going to do is their manufacturers are saying, okay, I'll build factories like automobile companies are going to be building more automobile plants in the United States. Steel. There are going to be steel companies that make steel in the United States. iPhone,
Apple. Rare earths.
Rare
problem?
earths.
We don't have them, but
well, we do. We do.
Yes, we've discovered some up in Dakotas.
Yes,
right?
up in the northern Midwest, slightly west.
Yeah, we don't have those industries really here, but we can have them based on some of these discoveries of deposits.
Yes.
Okay.
And so there's China controls right now. China controls a large percentage of the rare earth minerals. But
these are metals that are specialty metals used in semiconductors and things, and you have to have them to make this high tech stuff.
It's materials, and
Yes.
but we can. There are deposits of rare earth here in the United States, in Greenland. There's a lot of rare earth in Greenland
and in Greenland.
Yeah, and so there are other deposits of rare earth in the world, and Trump is determined to exploit those so that we are not dependent. He also wants us to be energy independent and actually an exporter of energy, which we will be. And but the fascinating thing to me is our political system is so different from China's political system. And China's political system, as we've discussed here, was moving toward being more liberal for 30 years, but then
turned back.
12 years ago, Xi Jinping came in and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to return to a more authoritarian, a centrally planned economy. And so that's where we sit as of today. And Trump and China are going back and forth with these tariffs, but China exports, if you include Vietnam and these satellite countries, China exports to the United States 4 times as much as they import. And so if China says, okay, we're gonna tariff your goods at the same we're gonna meet your tariff for tariff, well, it hurts China 4 times as much as it does the United States. And so Trump is holding, in my opinion, a better card economically. Now let's talk about the politics, though. Our system is that every 2 years we have elections. We just had one in November. The voters spoke, and they put Republicans in charge of the House, Republicans in charge of the Senate, and Trump as president. And the voters and Trump and the Republicans ran on a platform of cutting back the size of government, especially in the discretionary area, greatly reducing regulations, closing the border, and getting immigration under control, and then imposing tariffs to reduce our deficits, our trade deficit. Those were the main things that Trump ran on. Now, he ran on some other things, but those are the main things. And so Trump is now doing what he promised the voters he would do. The left does not like what Trump is doing. The government employee unions, I believe, see Trump truly as an existential threat to their existence. I think Trump, in the perfect world, Trump would eliminate government employee unions, which only exist as a matter of statute. There's nothing natural about government employee unions. They came about when JFK signed an executive order in 1961, and then they were enshrined by a statute passed by Congress during the Johnson years. And then various states have allowed government employee unions to exist in the state and local governments. Red states could eliminate government employee unions within their own states. Trump has announced an executive order, signed an executive order, where he took 18 agencies and did away with collective bargaining for 700,000 employees. That's being challenged in court, and probably under the current statutes, they have a legal right to do collective bargaining. But Congress has a right to eliminate federal employee unions, just as Congress enshrined them into law 60 years ago.
So, of course, there's fierce opinions about whether this is good or bad to defenestrate unions. It's worth saying that FDR was vigorously against government unions.
Yes.
So the idea that the left is for unions and the right is not a universal idea. You go back 100 years or 80 years to FDR, and he was vigorously against government unions.
Yeah.
Another thing to say is that unions in the private sector are now down to about 6% of the workforce.
That's correct.
But in the public sector, in government, it's like 30%.
Yeah, about 30 to 35%. And it's they're much stronger in some states and in some cities than in other states and cities.
And I think, as we've said in a prior podcast, this is a business model for the left to help that sector direct a lot of money their way. Mm-hmm. They pay it back in terms of support electorally in both money and work for them to get elected. So it's a virtuous cycle that they pat each other's back.
Correct. And so what you have now is that the Democrats, no matter what Trump does, they feel compelled to oppose it. Even though, for example, just a very few years ago, there's videos of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer calling for tariffs to protect U.S. manufacturing jobs.
This is because they wanted to be seen as the sponsors of the middle class, of the unionized workforce. They wanted to be their leader and maintain their allegiance. Right,
but when they made the arguments, they were exactly the same arguments that Trump is making now.
Right,
and so those very two same people are now saying that what Trump is doing is wrong, but yet for years they argued exactly what Trump is now doing. So it's fascinating to watch from a purely political standpoint. But our next election is not until November of 2026. The only thing that Democrats can do now to try to impede Trump's policies is to go to court and use the courts to have the courts say Trump can't do that.
So they don't have the votes in the Senate or the House if the parties stick together. If
right.
There's renegades, they might be able to trim away at some things, and that's happening in certain issues, right? But generally, if the parties maintain their unity on these issues, it's not going to get resolved there. They have to go to courts to try to challenge it.
They have to challenge them in courts, and you've got some judges in the Washington district courts that are siding against Trump or ruling against Trump. You've had the Supreme Court recently overturn. I'm talking about in the last 24 hours, overturn like two of those rulings. And so this process will play itself out. But as that process is playing out, Congress is going to be passing new laws and new statutes. And there's this bill called...
A statute is a law, right?
Yes, exactly.
You mean
thank
major
you.
laws and minor laws.
Thank you.
What that means.
Yes,
right?
yeah. Thank you. And that's Let's talk about that. Just for you have budgetary stuff, which is law, and then you have statutes, which and the only distinction I'm trying to make here is the statute is. It says that the government can do this or that. Right. The budgetary is the spending side, which that's what's happening now. Is this so-called great big? They're calling it the Great Big Beautiful Bill, and there's going to be two major pieces of legislation in the next 6 months. One is this so-called Great Big Beautiful Bill, and the other will be the budget for the next fiscal year, which begins October 1st. And the Great Big Beautiful Bill will have tax cuts, at least an extension, at least this is what I'm reading, at least an extension of the 2017 tax cuts. Yeah. Then there'll be eliminating taxes on tips, eliminating taxes on overtime, eliminating taxes on Social Security for retired people. And then there's some regulatory things, some spending cuts, money for the border, and money for the military.
So part of the disagreement coming up to this point has been whether those things should all be bundled together and passed as once, what they used to call omnibus legislation, where it's just all bundled together. Back to our theme of unification or diversification or centralizing and decentralizing, you do this piece by piece where everybody gets to say, I don't like this, but I like that. Right? Or you put it all in one big, beautiful bill, which is Trump's term, to say we're going to do it all at one time.
Yes.
Because it's too hard politically to do it piece by piece, and there's too much dissension and dilution of effort, and we won't get it all done unless we package it together.
Right, and
that's the logic, right?
Right, and the Republicans winning these 2 House seats in Florida recently now adds 2 to their numbers, and so it now looks like it's going to be 221 to 214.
So these were follow-on elections after the fall elections. There were a few offices that were vacated by appointments, and law in Florida required them to have an election to do that soon.
Right.
In other states, they appoint, the governor appoints or something like that. But in this case, they had to have an election, and Republicans won them both. And they kind of restored a little bit of the margin they had, but they don't have much margin.
They don't have much, but they have enough where they can lose. I believe they can lose 3, and maybe they can only lose 2, but I think they can lose 3. But at any rate, so there's this bill that deals with taxes and some spending. Then the next big bill will be the budget for the next fiscal year, and that will address a lot of what DOGE. This bill in May will address some of DOGE, but the bill in September will address much more. Now, then there's much more to be done after that in terms of reducing the size and the power of government if in fact federal deficits matter, which I believe, you and I believe that federal deficits matter.
Yes.
And that the best way to reduce federal deficits, we believe, is to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. And there's plenty of that in government to reduce the government spending by at least $1 trillion, which is a huge amount of money. It's hard to even.
Well, maybe for you, but not for me.
No, good. So getting back to and kind of finishing up, this is what we have is you have Xi Jinping, who is an all-powerful dictator in China, who is ruling over a country right now that's economically struggling, and we don't know how badly it's struggling because there's so much information that just doesn't come out. But we do know that they have
They do not have a vigorous press there.
No, they do not. And now the press there does know that if they write critical articles, they're going to go to jail. And so the information coming out of China is sparse. It's not accurate. And but we do know. I mean, just economic theory tells you that if the tariffs, if Trump keeps raising the tariffs on China, that the trade coming from China will go down, and that means that the unemployment levels, which are among young people in China right now, I've been told it exceeds 20% of young people under 30. That unemployment is a terrible problem for people under 30, and so if China is determined to govern or to act toward the U.S. the same way they act toward their own citizens, they can't control the U.S. the way they can control their own citizens. So it is going to be fascinating to watch over the next few weeks to see how this issue of trade deficits is resolved when we look to particularly to China. It looks to me like the rest of the world wants to come to the table and try to resolve things more or less on Trump's terms. And so now we get to U.S. politics. If things are resolved on Trump's terms, the Democrats have all aligned themselves with tariffs. Trump's tariffs are a terrible idea. And if it turns out that they're not a terrible idea, it makes it almost impossible for them to run effectively in the 2026 elections, midterms. And so it's just the politics of whatever Trump does is terrible. which is the position the left is taking, if it's not terrible, in fact, if it's good, then the 2026 midterms are going to be fascinating.
You know, if you go to downtown New York, there's a customs house there near where the stock exchange is, and that was where the federal government collected customs on imports. And that's the way that the U.S. government was financed from the founding up until the income tax was created like 150 years later.
Right.
Okay, so it used to be that all of the government income was from tariffs. This is not a new idea. The issue is it's been supplanted by income taxes.
Yeah, and you're referring to the federal government.
The federal government, yes.
Yes.
And so there may be a reordering here of the way in which the government gets its income. Conventional economic theory is that tariffs are bad because it's a tax on transactions and people can't buy as much when there's tax, right? But there's a comparison to be made between doing that and then taxing your income. You have more income if you can keep the tax cuts, reduce the size of government, enliven the private sector.
Yeah, and that's what's going to be interesting because, as you point out, the federal government lived almost exclusively on tariffs. But Calvin Coolidge, when he was president in the early 20s, this is after
1920s.
Yes, after the First World War, total federal spending, Mike, total federal spending was $3 billion. $7 trillion now. It was $3 billion. So you could live off of tariffs at the federal level.
So that's 2,000 times as much, right? Seven's roughly twice three, and a billion, trillion over billions, 1,000 more.
Yeah.
So it's 2,000 times more. Inflation hasn't been quite that high.
No.
It's grown in real terms, hundreds of, maybe 1,000%.
Yeah, I'm going to guess the federal government in real terms is at least 15 times bigger, at least, maybe 20, but much, much bigger. And so the point is you could live off of tariffs, and then everything else was done at the federal and state level.
Right.
And that's how things were for 150 years. Then the income tax was put in, and that was the beginning of the consolidation of power into Washington, D.C. And I don't want to get off on that track today, but that'd be a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to do that on a future podcast.
Yeah.
I want to say when we did series on war, our author on the Civil War said before the Civil War, the United States was a small U and a small s. It was a collection of states where the sovereignty was really local.
Yes.
And then after it was a capital U, and it was a unified country. And since 50 years after the Civil War, you dated it to the 1920s, and the figures you used, the central government has grown hugely.
Yes.
There's a political debate to be had about whether that is healthy and it unifies power, or whether segregating or distributing power, dividing power back to the states, where you can live in a high-tax state if you want to, and if you don't like it, you go somewhere else. Maybe that's a debate worth having.
Well, and we'll discuss that, and we'll have some charts that we show on what it has done to various categories of income, and I think
benefits?
who benefits from bigger government,
right.
Who benefits from big government, and who is left behind.
Right.
And so we'll discuss that. But Mike, I appreciate today.
This was fun,
and we will watch with great interest the world situation with tariffs, but particularly we'll watch it with China, because their form of government and our form of government could not be more different.
Right.
For two countries of their size.